John. So a few people asked me to talk about this John Tate generator that I have here, but if you permit me, I want to give you some backstory of how I arrived at this unit. A little over 25 years ago, my wife and I, she's pregnant with our son Brennan at the time, bought a 1850s farmhouse on 40 acres, kind of our dream property. And it was winter time. This was I think it was 1993 winter, December, right around Christmas. And one of the first nights in this farmhouse, we lost power due to an ice storm. Now, if you know much about construction back in the day, the farmhouse is balloon frame. And in a balloon frame house, you don't build a floor, stand walls on it, build a floor, stand walls on it. What you do is you have a foundation, you have walls that go from basically the foundation all the way up to the roof, 22-foot long studs. Then you lay a platform inside of that, and on the second floor you cut in a rim joist or a band into the studs, and then you lay a platform on that. And none of this was insulated. So you can go into our crawl space at the time and reach your hand up into the wall cavity, which means the cold air, the winter cold air, could go up the wall cavity. It could not only go all the way up to the attic on the second floor, but it could go in between the floors, between the first and second floor. So this thing was just an ideal, heated air conveyance system to take all the heat out of your house, as long as you weren't pumping heat into the house. So we lose power, and we figure, we'll be good till morning. Well, I'll tell you, come morning, the house was in like the mid-40s. I've never been in a house that was so cold as what this house got over the course of about 6 hours. So I said, gotta buy a generator. So it was a Sunday afternoon. We went out and just through Craigslist, or the Trading Post was a little local paper at the time, we found and bought a pin core. I believe it was a pin core, a little orange generator, 3,800 watts, and it had a cast iron Briggs & Stratton engine. It was what was available, paid a couple $100 for it, brought it home, wired it up to backfeed the electrical panel and through the main breaker. And I'll tell you what, that thing was awesome. That powered, at the time we had 2 oil furnaces, so it powered the burners and the fans, kept the whole house warm, could keep the fridge and the freezer running. 3,800 watts. And it was a heavy little generator, but it had an itty bitty fuel tank. I had to refuel it once, maybe twice a night. But it had the oomph. It was so heavy, and it was an all copper winding generator. It could start, when the refrigerator would start or when the well pump would start. It could handle it. The biggest drawback was didn't have wheels, and it had a tiny fuel tank. So I had to rig up a fuel supply to dip into a 5-gallon can, because when we lost power out here, we lost power. We've had 14-day outages, and this thing had to run nonstop. So at some point after 5, 6, 7 years, I said, I need to get a generator with a bigger fuel tank to run all night. I'm tired of getting up in the middle of the night. And I bought I think it was a DeVilbiss Powerback 5,500 watt generator with one of those top plastic mounted fuel tanks, extended run. And that did the trick. That got us through the night without filling it back up. But despite being rated for more power, it was not as good for running heavy loads. And when you looked at the size of the actual alternator on that DeVilbiss unit, it was lightweight. It was about half the size of the little pin core, and it just didn't do the job. Now, both of those were 3,600 RPM generators. They would just scream. And they had 2-pole alternators. And I made the decision when I went to upgrade again, I wanted to go to an 1,800 RPM machine, which had a 4-pole alternator, run slower. I wanted to get a diesel because I had diesel on the property. We had the oil furnaces, and there was kind of an unlimited supply of off-road diesel to power these generators. And I was actually looking at there's a couple companies that refurbish the GMC Jimmy, the Deuce. It's a 2-cylinder diesel with a side blower on it, and these units came out of refrigerated rail cars, They actually ran at 1200 RPM. So these were 6-pole alternators. They were 3-phase, or could be configured for single phase. And never did end up getting one of those, but I happened upon this John Tate. Now the John Tate generator has a Deutz 2-cylinder air-cooled diesel. It has a blower fan here that ducts the air in to cool the cylinders. And it has a 3-phase alternator as well. This is a 7.5 kilowatt alternator. But this thing simultaneously puts out 3-phase 240 and single-phase 240, 120 neutral and then on the other side. And I don't know how they do it, because you have to configure 3-phase alternators to either do 3-phase, or they call it zigzag single-phase, where they cross-connect the windings in a specific way. This thing must have like a center-tapped winding to be able to produce simultaneously the 3-phase and the single-phase. But I'll walk you around, I'll show you some of the features. The box on the front is just basically a battery box, and I keep a can of starting fluid and a spare breaker set in there, and that just bungees itself shut. A GM alternator on it that someone cobbled on. Won't win any beauty contests, although it seems like nothing I have wins any beauty contests. I redid the blower with new bearings, put new bearings in. This thing is really well made. And I also put a new bearing on the tail of the alternator back here. I went ahead and I took this off and put a new tail bearing in. It's mounted to a frame that is the actual fuel tank of the generator. So there's no external tank, and it has enough capacity in the tank frame to run for 12 hours at full load without refueling. It will certainly get through the night. I've had no issues with it. In the box on here, we have 210 volt outlets, and we have a locking plug type 240 1-phase, and we have another locking plug 3-phase outlet, and that's where our breaker is, and that's a spare. But other than being an extremely loud generator, even though it runs 1800 RPM, it is pretty loud, and you've heard it run. All conversation ceases when the generator is running. This might be a little bit hard to see, but the axle's got these cool torsion spring suspension. So basically, this rigidly mounts to the underside of the tank frame. You've seen those trailer axles got the rubber like molded in torsion element. Well, this one has these springs. I just hope that they never break for any reason, because I don't know that I'd ever be able to get a replacement. But maybe I should just keep them well oiled. It also holds a pretty significant amount of oil. There's a filter right here. If you unscrew this cap, it's a cleanable internal oil filter. And I think if I remember correctly, this thing held like 6 or 8 quarts, which there's the engine tag, F2L410. I've been asked what engine model that was, so it's an F2L410. Anyway, yeah, 6 or 8 quarts capacity on the oil sump, which is not unusual for these small industrial engines to hold quite a bit of oil. And from what I can tell, that is just some kind of a counterweight that's bolted onto the underside of the engine. It's just an additional mass that probably helps dampen vibration. The generator also has this lifting tongue on it for the sole purpose of parking the generator up in the sky. If you've ever seen driven by a construction site, you look up and the crane has got a generator suspended from it, 50 feet in the air to prevent theft, which it surprises me because it's absolutely against OSHA, regulations to do that. You can't leave a load suspended by a crane when there's no operator in the crane, and I've seen it all the time. But I lifted this the other day with the 3-ton hoist in the shop here, and it doesn't balance well. It kind of goes tongue down, probably because of the battery in the box, but it's kind of a cool feature. So if I ever want to tow this thing around, I can tow it around. It does have a suspension. It did have working lights until they got all busted up, but I imagine I could put replacements in there. It has a place for a license plate and a auxiliary tongue to haul something behind it, I guess. One of the things, I think it's on one of the patents, the John Tate patents, is the frame, which is made of, I think 3x6 rectangular tubing, is actually the fuel tank. It's a perimeter frame, and the fuel line comes in tapped off of the bottom of that. And we've got a brass capped filler here. And this holds about 10 gallons, which is plenty for an overnight run. I know there's a lot of nights where we've had power outages, and we've run the generator all night, and it isn't really even close to running itself out of fuel. So been using it a lot here at the shop, and it'll definitely take 5. I thought it would take 5. So it has a spin-on fuel filter, external fuel pump with a priming plunger, dipstick for checking the oil. This is the governor setting, which sets it at 1800 RPM. This is a priming or an excess fuel button. If you push that in, you get excess fuel when you crank, and then it has a centrifugal release. It pops back up once it's running. I've had mixed luck with it. I don't know if it helps more than it hurts, because it does seem to tend to flood the engine sometimes. If it's really cold outside, I go ahead and I use it. But I've successfully started it, in the 30s or even the upper 20s, and not had to use that. There's an oil bath type air filter. There's the starter arrangement. There's a key starter that will enable the generator. And then pull out to the first stop, preheats the glow plugs. Give it a 15 or 20 seconds of heat. And then pulling all the way will start it. To shut it off, you just pull this knob out and hold it, and this disengages the fuel pump cam. So you just pull that, and then the engine will stop.